The morning sun cast long shadows across the Galactic Military Academy's main courtyard on Centauri Prime, where cadets from 17 different species gathered for their daily combat assessment. The Academy's sprawling complex, built into the mountainous terrain of humanity's first successful terraforming project, buzzed with nervous energy as first-year students prepared for their practical examinations. Cadet Maria Santos adjusted her standard-issue training uniform, a fabric still stiff from the fabricators. At barely 5'4", she stood among her fellow cadets like a child among giants. The Catherian beside her towered nearly 8 feet tall, his exoskeleton gleaming under the artificial suns that supplemented Centauri Prime's pale yellow star. 3 Zelanti cadets chittered excitedly in their clicking language, their crystalline forms refracting the light into prismatic rainbows across the Academy's polished stone floors. Today's assessment will test your ability to adapt to unfamiliar combat styles, announced Commander Veltar through the Universal Translator system. The insectoid officer's mandibles clicked with authority as she gestured toward the combat rings. You've been paired randomly across species lines. Remember, this is about technique and adaptability, not brute force. Maria glanced at her assignment. Tablet, Ring 7 partner, Zextar of House Kiltherin, Catherian Dominion. She looked up to see a massive figure approaching, his chitinous armor plates shifting with each deliberate step. Zextar's forearms moved in what she recognized as the traditional Catherian gesture of acknowledgement, though his multifaceted eyes held an unmistakable glint of amusement. So, the Academy pairs the apex predator with the prey animal. Zextar rumbled, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made Catherian speech sound like grinding stone. I suppose they want to see how quickly I can demonstrate proper restraint with delicate species. Other cadets had begun to gather around Ring 7, drawn by the obvious mismatch. A cluster of Altarian observers floated nearby, their gaseous forms shimmering with curiosity. Even the stoic Drakmari had turned their reptilian heads to watch, their scales shifting color in what Maria had learned indicated anticipation. Restraint, Maria repeated, rolling the word around in her mouth as she secured her protective gear. Interesting word choice. She'd grown up in the Titan mining colonies, where restraint was a luxury most couldn't afford. Her father had taught her that in the unforgiving environment of Saturn's largest moon, there were 2 types of people: those who learned to hit hard and fast, and those who didn't come home got the referee, a hegemony android with chrome plating polished to mirror brightness, scanned both cadets with its optical sensors. Combatants will engage in controlled sparring. First to achieve 3 decisive contact points or force submission wins the match. Excessive force protocols are in effect. Zextar flexed his primary arms, each one easily twice the thickness of Maria's torso. His species had dominated Galactic combat sports for over 3 centuries, their natural armor and multiple limbs giving them overwhelming advantages against most opponents. In the Academy's recorded history, no Catherian had ever lost a first-year combat assessment. I'll try to make this educational rather than embarrassing, Zextar said, settling into his species' traditional combat stance. His secondary arms wove a complex pattern in the air, a psychological tactic designed to confuse opponents about which limbs would strike first. Maria simply stood straight, her hands loose at her sides, breathing steady. To the watching aliens, she appeared almost catatonic in her stillness. What they couldn't see was the calculated assessment happening behind her dark eyes, cataloging every detail of her opponent's stance, reach, and movement patterns. Growing up in low-gravity environments had taught her that the biggest opponents often made the biggest mistakes, and those mistakes created the biggest opportunities. The android referee raised one gleaming hand. Combat assessment begins in 3.2. Ungage. Asterisk Zextar moved with the fluid confidence of a predator who had never known defeat. His species' fighting style, perfected over millennia, relied on overwhelming opponents with multiple, simultaneous attacks, while their natural armor absorbed any counterstrikes. As he advanced across the combat ring's padded surface, his four arms began their intricate dance, each limb moving in carefully choreographed arcs designed to leave no defensive gaps to the watching cadets. It looked like an inevitable conclusion. The slight human remained motionless in the center of the ring, apparently frozen by the approaching assault. Whispered commentary rippled through the crowd in a dozen alien languages, most expressing sympathy for what seemed like an unfortunate mismatch in the Academy's pairing algorithm. Maria's eyes tracked every movement with the precision of someone who had learned combat as survival rather than sport. The Catherian's technique was flawless by Academy standards, controlled, predictable, and designed for scoring points rather than ending threats. Each strike telegraphed its intention with the subtle shifts in his exoskeleton plates, giving her a roadmap of his attack pattern. As Zextar closed to striking distance, his confidence swelled. The human hadn't even raised her guard, confirming his assumption that this would be a brief, educational demonstration. His primary right arm cocked back in the classic Catherian opening gambit, a controlled strike meant to establish dominance, while his other limbs prepared follow-up attacks. "Perhaps next time you'll request a more suitable opponent," he said, launching the strike toward Maria's shoulder with what he considered appropriate restraint. In his mind, this gentle contact would end the match quickly and save the human from further embarrassment. The blow connected with a soft thud against Maria's shoulder, barely enough force to stagger most Academy cadets. As Ixtar began to pull back, already shifting into his victory stance, when something impossible happened. Instead of stumbling backward or calling for the referee to stop the match, Maria pivoted on her left foot, using the momentum of his strike to spin into what looked like a dancer's graceful turn. For a split second, time seemed suspended in the combat ring. Zextar's multifaceted eyes tracked the human's movement with growing confusion. This wasn't any defensive technique taught in Academy curricula. His species' combat manuals contained no references to such a response pattern. Warning signals began firing in his neural clusters as Maria completed her pivot, her right fist rising in what appeared to be slow motion. The human's counterstrike caught him perfectly under his mandible ridge, the one spot where Catherian exoskeletons remained vulnerable to allow for feeding mechanisms. What Zextar had perceived as gentle contact from his own strike had actually provided Maria with exactly the positioning and momentum she needed. Her small fist, backed by the rotational force of her entire body and guided by reflexes honed in environments where hesitation meant death, struck with surgical precision. The sound that echoed through the combat ring wasn't the controlled impact of Academy sparring. It was the sharp, wet crack of chitin failing under unexpected stress. Zextar's confident advance transformed instantly into a stumbling collapse as his jaw structure, evolved for crushing metal ores on his homeworld, but never designed to absorb, focused impact at its junction points, simply shattered. The watching cadets fell silent, their various forms of communication ceasing as they processed what they had just witnessed. The massive Catherian warrior, pride of the Galactic combat leagues, was on his knees clutching his ruined jaw, while the diminutive human stood exactly where she had started, breathing steady, watching him with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the encounter. Maria extended her hand toward the fallen alien, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had just completed a routine task. "Need help getting to the medical bay?" The Academy's medical facility had seen its share of training injuries, but the emergency treatment bay had never hosted such a crowd of observers. Cadets from every species pressed against the transparent aluminum viewing wall, watching as the medical androids worked to reconstruct Zextar's shattered mandible structure. The Catherian lay sedated on the treatment table, his massive form looking somehow diminished under the harsh medical lighting. Commander Veltar stood in the center of the crowd, her compound eyes reflecting the facility's sterile illumination. As she reviewed the combat ring's sensor data on her tactical display, the measurements made no sense according to standard kinetic analysis. The human strike had generated forces that should have been impossible given her body mass and the apparent speed of her movement. Replay sequence 47 through 51. She ordered the combat AI. The holographic display shimmered, recreating those crucial seconds in perfect detail. Frame by frame, Maria's counterstrike unfolded like a physics lecture in applied violence. The pivot that used Zextar's own momentum, the precise targeting of his species' singular vulnerability, the way she had channeled her entire body's energy into a single focused point of impact. Dr. Keshran, the facility's chief medical officer and one of the few hegemony citizens to specialize in multispecies physiology, emerged from the treatment area, wiping his surgical manipulators clean. The amphibious being's skin patterns shifted to the dark blue-green that indicated professional concern. "The damage is extensive, but repairable," he announced to the assembled group. "However, I must note that this injury pattern is unlike anything in our combat training databases." The force application was extraordinarily precise, targeting the exact structural weakness in Catherian jaw architecture. His large eyes focused on Maria, who stood quietly at the back of the crowd. "How did you know about that vulnerability?" Maria stepped forward, her movement causing the other cadets to unconsciously part before her. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she found herself the focus of genuine attention rather than dismissive amusement. "I didn't know it was a vulnerability," she said simply. "I just hit where it looked like it would hurt most." The statement sent ripples of unease through the alien observers. Commander Veltar's mandibles clicked in what Maria was learning to recognize as deep thought. "Explain your combat training background, Cadet Santos." "I don't have formal combat training," Maria replied, her voice carrying the slight accent of the outer colonies. "I grew up on Titan Station 7 in the deep mining sectors. My father taught me that if someone hits you, you hit them back hard enough that they don't want to try it again." A Zelanti cadet near the front of the crowd chimed in crystalline harmonics, its translated voice carrying confusion. But the Academy's psychological profiles indicated humans were a passive species, preferring negotiation to conflict. Maria almost smiled at that. Whoever wrote those profiles never spent time in the Belt colonies. Out there, negotiation works great, right up until the life support fails or the ore pirates show up, and you need to know how to fight. Dr. Keshran was studying his medical scanners with growing fascination. According to these readings, Cadet Santu's bone density is 40% higher than Earth-normal human baselines. Her muscle fiber composition shows unusual fast-twitch development, and her reaction times— He paused, recalibrating his instruments. "Her reaction times are measuring at the upper limits of known biological response speeds." Commander Veltar absorbed this information, her tactical mind beginning to reassess everything she thought she knew about human capabilities. "Cadet Santos, what percentage of human population would you estimate shares your ... background?" "You mean outer colony survival training?" Maria considered the question seriously. "Maybe 30% of humans grow up in high-stress environments, where you learn to fight or you don't make it to adulthood. The rest live on the inner worlds where they can afford to be peaceful." She gestured toward the medical bay, where Zextar was slowly regaining consciousness. "But even inner-world humans learn basic self-defense. It's just that most of us have been trying really hard to be polite since joining the galactic community." The implications of her words settled over the assembled cadets like a cold wind. If Maria represented the trained end of human combat capability, and she considered herself basically average for her background. Then the galactic community's understanding of human nature was fundamentally flawed. Word of the incident spread through the academy faster than data streams, through the quantum communication network. By evening mealtime, every cadet in the complex had heard some version of the story, with details growing more dramatic with each retelling. The cafeteria, normally a cacophony of interspecies social interaction, had developed distinct zones. As different alien groups clustered together, casting sideways glances at the human tables, Maria sat with her usual meal companions, mix of species that had been randomly assigned to her dormitory wing during orientation week. The conversation, typically a blend of academic gossip and cultural exchange, had taken on a decidedly different tone. "Is it true that all humans can fight like that?" asked Piptar, a young Altarian whose gaseous form shimmered with nervous colors. Their species, evolved from atmospheric organisms, had never developed physical combat capabilities, relying instead on collective intelligence and technological superiority. "Like what?" Maria asked around a bite of synthesized protein that was supposed to approximate Earth beef, but tasted more like cardboard with nutritional supplements. "Like you did today," said Vecmer, one of the Drakmari engineering students. His scales had been shifting between orange and red all day, indicating sustained agitation. "The way you analyzed Zextar-S attack pattern and responded with such precision." Maria set down her eating utensil, recognizing that this conversation was going to require full attention. Around the cafeteria, she could see other groups, engaged in similar discussions, though most were speaking in their native languages, rather than the standard galactic common tongue. "I didn't analyze anything," she said carefully. "Someone took a swing at me, and I hit them back. That's pretty much how fights work." "But the targeting," pressed Dr. Yelleneth, a hegemony medical student who had apparently been researching human physiology since the morning's incident. "You struck the exact point where Catherian exoskeleton structure is weakest. That suggests either extensive xenobiological knowledge or I looked for where it would hurt most and hit there," Maria finished. "Same thing I'd do if someone tried to sucker punch me back home." She glanced around the table at her companion's various expressions of confusion and concern. "Look, I'm not some kind of combat specialist. I'm an engineering student who knows how to throw a punch. The only difference between me and most humans is that I learned it from necessity instead of recreation." Across the cafeteria, she noticed a commotion at one of the Catherian tables. Zextar had returned from the medical bay, his jaw reconstructed, but still bearing the obvious marks of surgical intervention. He was surrounded by members of his species, their harmonized vocalizations creating a low, threatening rumble that was causing other nearby tables to clear out. The largest of the group, wearing the rank insignia of a senior cadet, stood and began moving toward Maria's table. His approach caused a ripple effect throughout the cafeteria as conversation stopped and attention focused on the developing situation. Cadet Santos, the Catherian senior, announced in heavily accented Galactic. "Common, I am Kexaval of House Kiltherin, clutch brother to Zextar. Honor demands that I address the injury done to my family." Maria stood slowly, noting how her human companions seemed to shrink back while her alien friends tensed in various species-specific ways. The cafeteria had gone completely silent now, with over 300 cadets watching to see how this confrontation would unfold. "Okay," Maria said simply, her hands relaxed at her sides in the same position she had maintained in the combat ring. "What did you want to address?" Kexavol's multifaceted eyes studied her carefully, clearly trying to reconcile her small stature with the evidence of what she had done to his clutch brother. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "I wish to understand how you learned to fight with such effectiveness against our species. This knowledge could be valuable to both our peoples." 3 weeks after the incident in Ring 7, the Academy had quietly implemented what administrators called revised interspecies combat protocols. The changes were subtle but significant. Mixed species sparring matches now required both participants to demonstrate their techniques against training dummies before engaging with live opponents, and all combat instructors had received intensive briefings on human physiological capabilities. Maria found herself in an unexpected position as the unofficial human representative to a hastily formed interspecies combat study group. The meetings took place in one of the Academy's smaller conference rooms, overlooking the terraformed valleys of Centauri Prime, where Earth origin trees grew alongside alien flora in carefully maintained ecological balance. The fundamental issue, explained Commander Veltar to the assembled group, is that our entire understanding of human combat capability was based on diplomatic and academic exchanges. We never consulted with humans who had actual fighting experience. Around the conference table sat representatives from the major galactic species, along with a handful of human cadets who had been quietly identified as having non-standard backgrounds. Maria wasn't the only one who had grown up in the outer colonies, it turned out. Nearly a quarter of human Academy cadets came from environments where physical conflict was a routine part of life. Zextar, his jaw now fully healed, but bearing permanent scarring from the reconstruction, leaned forward in his specially adapted chair. What troubles me most is that Cadet Santos wasn't trying to demonstrate superior technique. She was simply defending herself. That's correct, said Cadet Shun Wei, who had grown up on one of the asteroid mining platforms in the Sol systems. Outer Belt. Where I come from, if someone hits you, you end the fight as quickly as possible. There's no such thing as a fair fight when life support can fail if the wrong equipment gets damaged. Dr. Keshron consulted his research notes, accumulated over weeks of studying human combat responses. What we're discovering is that humans possess what might be called scalable aggression. In peaceful environments, they naturally suppress their combat instincts. But when threatened, these instincts activate with remarkable speed and efficiency. Kexival, who had become something of an unofficial student of human fighting techniques, added his own observations. In our species, combat is ritualized, controlled. We fight to establish dominance or to prove skill. But humans fight to survive, which means they fight to win by any means necessary. Maria had been listening to these discussions for weeks now, watching as her fellow cadets and instructors tried to categorize and understand something that had always seemed perfectly natural to her. I think you're making it more complicated than it needs to be, she said finally. The room's attention focused on her, as it had learned to do whenever she spoke about combat. Despite her continued protests that she wasn't any kind of expert, her practical experience had proven invaluable in helping the Academy understand human capabilities. Humans aren't naturally more violent than other species, she continued. We're just naturally more adaptable. If the environment requires us to be peaceful, we're peaceful. If it requires us to be fighters, we learn to fight. The problem is that most galactic species evolved in environments that favored specialization. You became really good at one thing and built your civilization around that advantage. She gestured toward the window, where human-planted oak trees grew next to Alterian crystal formations and Drakmari heat flowers. Humans evolved on a world that kept changing the rules on us. Ice ages, climate shifts, predators, diseases, natural disasters. We learned to adapt to whatever the universe threw at us, and fighting was just one of the skills we picked up along the way. Commander Veltar's mandibles clicked in understanding. So when humans joined the galactic community, we adapted to that too, Maria finished. We learned to be diplomatic because that's what the situation required. But we didn't forget the other skills. We just put them away until we needed them again. The implications of this revelation were still rippling through the Academy's administration. and through them, to the various galactic governments. Humanity's role in the galactic community was being quietly reassessed, with new emphasis placed on understanding the full range of human capabilities, rather than just their peaceful, diplomatic persona. As the meeting concluded and the various cadets began filing out, Zextar approached Maria with something that might have been a smile, if Getherians could smile. "I have a question that's been bothering me," he said. "Shoot. If you're not considered a particularly skilled fighter by human standards, and you learned your techniques from a mining engineer father rather than formal training." He paused, his multifaceted eyes studying her face. "How good are your actual warriors?" Maria considered the question seriously, thinking about the Earth Defense Force Marines she had occasionally encountered during supply runs, the veteran belt miners who had survived decades in environments that killed careless people, the inner-world combat sports athletes who fought for entertainment rather than survival. "I honestly don't know," she said finally. "I guess we'll all find out together if anyone's ever stupid enough to pick a real fight with humanity." The thought hung in the air between them as they looked out at the peaceful valley below, where different species have learned to coexist in carefully maintained harmony. But now they both understood that this harmony existed not because humans couldn't fight, but because they had chosen not to. Asterisk.